What happens when you crank the heat to rival Florida in July, double the tree count, and crank the rain levels until it feels like a scene from Rambo, all inside of a vintage story world. Apparently, it gets something very close to that horrible Arnold movie we don't talk about. Predator.
Billy, you know something. What is it?
I'm scared, Pancho.
Bullshit. You ain't afraid of no man.
There's something out there waiting for us. And it ain't no man.
But if you know me, you know I didn't stop there. No hardcore playthrough this time, because frankly, the addition of bolt horns and the shivers absolutely ruined it for me. But I did steal a few nightmares from the Wilderness Survival preset. Random respawn radius? 5,000 blocks. Temporal gear respawn uses? You get one. Then I spiced things up even more. I enabled soil instability, cave-ins, and made sure lightning could set everything I loved on fire. All on top of the other horrible consequences of the scorching high temperatures. Food spoilage rates? Faster than the leftovers you forgot at a barbecue. Farming? Basically impossible. Think gardening in Mordor. To add insult to an injury, I installed Hydrate or Dihydrate, a thirst mod so brutal, it had me questioning my life choices before day 2. But hey, it's not all pain. I also used the Rivers mod and Terra Preti for terrain, and with the increased tree density, I ended up with one of the most jaw-droppingly gorgeous worlds in Vintage Stories history. Granted, it was so CPU intensive, I had to play it on a homemade server, but with the benefit of a camera account. And yes, I'm using a map this time, I'm not crazy. Oh, and I'm running the Working Classes mod and playing as a miner. Think tunnel rat with insane pickaxe skills, but the range capabilities of a wet potato. So, if any of this madness sounds appealing, come join me in the thicket, deep in the jungle, in the Great Jungle Challenge. Here I was, in the sea of green. Everywhere I looked, a thick wall of trees, vines, and shrubs stared at me, daring me to take my first steps. I started walking north and immediately encountered a treasure hunter in the middle of the jungle. How did the cart end up here, completely surrounded by trees? Who knows? Regardless, I wouldn't have anything to trade him anytime soon. Using his mobile cart as a temporary base was tempting. However, in my testing, I discovered that the jungle was not a hospitable environment for a base. Drifters would often spawn here even during the day, in the shades of these gigantic trees. Instead, I found what looked like an open area on my map and trekked towards it while collecting flint rocks. I decided to visit a few bodies of water on the way. Once I reached the first small lake, I beat the local kapok tree for sticks and nabbed a flint knife. This stone tool allowed me to start collecting local papyrus, growing in the bunches in the water. This in turn allowed me to craft hand baskets to expand my inventory. I continued collecting papyrus with the idea of crafting reed chests, but was rudely interrupted by a local shiver. Not wanting the smoke, I ran away like a coward until the thicket of the jungle started to clear out and turned into less dense bamboo fields. Lakes here were much safer for papyrus collection. Soon, I had to address my thirst and my hunger. Both would be a huge issue for a while. I helped myself to some bamboo shoots, a food source that would be my primary solution to hunger for a while. Once I collected enough shoots, I drank fresh water out of the lake and processed the shoots with a knife to acquire the edible components. My immediate needs were satisfied, and I continued onwards until I found fairly open, acacia-adorned plains. Since I had no way to store water, I decided to settle near a small lake. I placed down 2 reed chests and nabbed a shovel to collect local soil. I converted the soil into packed dirt, a trick I learned from a wilderness survival challenge to deal with the soil instability. First, I laid out a foundation for a small dirt hut. Then, I raised the walls and put in the roof. And there it was, a true starter house. Next, I nabbed an axe and cut down a small kapok. Besides providing wood, this small tree provided me with enough vines to craft more rope than I knew what to do with. Following, I split the logs into firewood, collected dry grass, and made a small fire with the freshly crafted fire starter. I used the fire starter to also light a torch I crafted from dry grass and a stick. All that was left to do was to craft a simple door and place it into the frame on my new dwelling. On the inside, I used a knife to clear the interior of the grass, which I used to craft a hay bed. Sleep was tempting, but there was no rest for the wicked. I set off in the darkness to collect more bamboo shoots. I wanted a large supply before my next venture. Once that was done, I returned to my dirt hut and used my strategically placed back door to drink water. Then I ate a few shoots and was ready to rock. Next, I crafted improvised armor from the firewood and grass. Following, I chopped down some bamboo, harvested a few sticks from the acacias, and crafted a crude shield. These would provide some defenses for when the rift activity inevitably picked up. Now that I had a few basics, it was time to work towards copper progression, and that meant finding clay. I swam across a river and immersed myself into the rainy thicket. Finding clay in this dense environment was no ordinary task. The trees, the vines, and the undergrowth made spotting clay extremely hard. Instead, I found a building materials trader stuck in the jungle. He wasn't much help, so I continued the search. I would often swim through small rivers in hopes of spotting clay on the exposed banks. However, soil instability made climbing out more trouble than it was worth. Eventually, I spotted the coveted block mixed among copious amounts of sand. I went to town on the deposit and collected a few stacks of the sticky substance. With clay at hand, I ran back to my makeshift base through the acacia plains while taking note of any soybeans growing around here. Once back, I started working on the clay molds required for the next stage. I formed a pickaxe mold, a prospecting pick mold, and a hammer mold. I also needed a few bowls to go along with the cooking pot. Of course, a crucible was required for smelting as well. Finally, I clay formed a bunch of jugs to carry water. Currently, my activity range was severely limited because my thirst bar drained faster than iPhone's battery on max brightness, watching YouTube at 3 a.m.
Damn! 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 Damn it! What the f—
These jugs would expand my range quite a bit. The rift activity was still non-existent, so I could go outside in the middle of the night to start working on the clay firing pits. Once the pits were done, I stuffed them full of clay goodies. Being afraid of the rain dousing my pits, I built a makeshift roof just in case. Grass was plentiful, so I collected a bunch and placed it into the pits. Collecting sticks without shears is my least favorite activity, but it had to be done. The bamboo leaves did not provide sticks, instead I looked for small kapok trees on the perimeter of the plains. Once I had enough, into the pits they went. Then I placed the firewood over the pits and lit the whole thing up. It was a lot of work, but a big batch of clay offerings was on its way. While the pits were doing their thing, I dug out a small hole to start a charcoal pit. I only had a little bit of wood, so off I went to cut down local kapoks again. Luckily, there were very large trees that provided a lot of wood, and it took me no time to stock up on a bunch. Soon, I was able to cover the charcoal pit with soil and to start the process. As the night was setting in, I went back to the river's bank to grab some loose sand for panning. The river was truly the MVP of this playthrough and provided a lot of value throughout. I made it back to my dirt hut with a stack, but here I had some bad news. The rift activity had finally picked up and my first drifter waltzed through the door. Dana Tweaks was the mod that granted drifters this power. The solution was to start barricading myself inside at all times. Meanwhile, I decided to set up a panning operation. Besides a steady drinking water supply, building my hut this close to the lake gave me an ability to create one inside of my hut. So I dug out a trench connecting to the lake and started panning the river sand. The trench did have one critical flaw. The crawling drifters could squeeze into the opening. I didn't have an immediate solution and just crossed my fingers while continuing panning. In the morning, I felt claustrophobic and unbarricaded myself to pan outside. It was a lot nicer to pan out in the sun, and the fresh air didn't hurt either. Soon, an intense fog settled on the plains to coincide with my intense hunger. I spotted a few gazelles prancing around and attempted to hunt them down with a bunch of freshly napped flint spears. This is where the range limitations of my minor class really started to show. I struggled to get into the spear's range without spooking the gazelles. I found that the only way I could score a kill was to chase them into bamboo, where they would often get stuck in a thicket. Another way was to chase them into the turbulent river. The river's flow, however, made this a difficult and frustrating affair. Regardless of the method, hunting gazelles was a slow and tedious process. Nonetheless, by the end of the day, I had enough to make a full pot of meat stew while barricading myself for the night. Panning was back on the menu, with the drifters moaning on the outside at all times. During the day, I would move outside for fresh air and better ambience. While attempting to clean out my inventory during a session, I noticed that I managed to pan a temporal gear, a pretty rare occasion from a block of sand indeed. I would eventually ditch the plains for greener pastures, and thus I had no plans to use the gear just yet. Next, it was time to dig out the charcoal from the ground. Following, I crafted a pair of tongs. Luckily, I had infinite rope to craft tongs and anything else for that matter. I loaded the crucible with 300 units of copper and placed it into the charcoal fire. Soon, I poured the molten copper into the pickaxe mold, the prospecting pick mold, and the hammer mold. Besides these tools, I would also need an oil lamp, which I crafted from the gazelle fat and a bowl. Once the copper was solidified, I crafted the tools and prospected the chunk directly underneath me as the first order of business. The prospecting results showed some deep native copper. At 3%, it was hardly anything to write home about, but it was enough for me to give it a shot. With the lake nearby, it was easy enough to dig a hole in the bottom and descend down while prospecting every 10 blocks. Around Y50, the prospecting pick search yielded a result. The copper was just 4 blocks below that at Y46. I went to town on the copious amount of ore down here. In fact, the pickaxe gave up long before the copper ran out, and I had to ascend back to my base. I immediately broke a few ores into nuggets with a hammer and smelted another copper pickaxe. While the pickaxe was cooling, I chopped down the nearest acacia and crafted a raft with the logs. I also made an acacia ore to go along with the raft. I was preparing to ditch my starting base at this point to look for something a little more visually inspiring. Once the pickaxe was ready, I submerged into the lake and went down a familiar shaft. Here, I mined out even more copper until the amounts started to dwindle. To help with the search, I started to strategically use cave-ins to quickly move large amounts of rock. Soon, there was nothing else to mine, and I emerged from the watery shaft. However, the rift activity forced me indoors quickly. I slept through the night, and in the morning, my mission was to gather as many soybean seeds as I could find. As a bonus, I found gazelle calf stuck in a thicket and helped myself to its meat. Between the soybeans and the meat, I managed to cook up a stew.
Whoa. There's still plenty of meat on that bone. Now you take this home, throw it in a pot, add some broth, a potato. Baby, you got a stew going.
As the nightfall dropped, I prepared the raft for the great journey. One reed chest could be mounted on the raft, and one I would carry on my back, courtesy of the carry-on mod. I slept through another night and woke up early in the morning, ready for the grand adventure. I said my goodbyes to the acacia plains that housed me up to this point and ran to the river to mount my raft. The river's current was a huge boon and helped me travel downstream extremely rapidly. I would utilize this method a lot going forward. I kept going downstream, surrounded by a dense thicket, until the banks opened up again into more acacia plains. Soon, the river dropped me into a huge bay, opening up into the ocean, where I decided to keep left. I went around an acacia landmass while keeping close to the shore. I saw an interesting spot on the map that was calling my name. This area was cut from both sides by 2 small rivers flowing into the bay. I had an easily accessible acacia landmass to the east, a dense jungle to the south, a tall mountain to the west, and an endless ocean to the north. The area was relatively flat and was a crossroad to a large biome variety. As a bonus, the bay was a central dumping ground for inland rivers, offering easy transportation. It looked like an ideal spot to settle. I placed the hay bed and the reed chest down, and then secured my spawn with a temporal gear, the one I panned from the sand earlier. One downside of the new location, the bay and the initial stretch of the river was all salt water. Thus, I had a long trek to the potable water anytime I was thirsty, which was of course a lot. My general game plan was to find bronze alloys before attempting to build any serious infrastructure. I started smelting more copper for mining tools, but the drifters forced me into the bed early. In the morning, I grabbed a prospecting pick and prospected the new home chunk. The results returned ultra-high bismuth, which was a good start. There was also a small amount of zinc, the second component for the bismuth bronze alloy. The river provided the water necessary for my murky descent into the mining shaft. The prospecting pick almost immediately picked up on traces of bismuth. Around 180, I started branching out sideways in order to locate the first alloy component. However, the metal kept being elusive. I kept digging 5 long, single-block shafts in all directions, trying to locate the source. I could not locate the node, however. Frustrated, I emerged on the river's bank and tried a brand new shaft nearby, hoping for better luck. Here, I employed the same branch mining strategy again, and eventually found a good-sized bismuth deposit. Once again, I was utilizing strategic cave-ins to assist me in locating every last bit. Next, I continued with the strategy of digging new mine shafts in the river, and soon was rewarded with another bismuth deposit. I stayed underground until my copper pickaxe came apart, and then emerged to deposit the bismuth ore into the storage. Needless to say, bismuth proved to be incredibly easy to find. Zinc, however, was another story. I smelted another pickaxe and a prospecting pick in preparation. Before getting back to mining, I decided to look for clay. I could not afford to bring clay with me due to the limited storage space. Thus, I would have to figure out a new source. I decided to explore the southern direction first. Here, directly behind a small ridge, lay another section of dense and thick jungle. This area, however, was seemingly dominated by bamboo instead of kapok. I scouted the area completely directionless. I don't think there was any sensible way to search for things in this environment. Eventually, the blind exploration paid off and I found a rather modest deposit of red clay. I dug out a ton of this red substance and took it back to my base. As soon as I got back, I clay formed an anvil mold and 6 ingot molds. I then dug out holes in the ground and stuffed the clay offerings inside. I cleared the pit area from grass to prevent any brush fires and stuffed this grass into the pits. The night was setting in and I was about to have a drifter problem. Thus, I pivoted by diving into one of the old mine shafts. I picked up traces of zinc in the shaft earlier. Finding the source was almost more trouble than it was worth. It took a while to locate and the deposit itself was exceedingly small. Luckily, I was using the X skills mod, which allowed me to level beneficial skills. Naturally, as a miner, I was much faster at leveling mining related skills. I hit level 3 into mining and selected another point into the careful miner trait, which helped me to get more ore out of these small deposits. In combination with my innate miner class traits, my ore yields were greatly improved. I continued looking for zinc with sideways shafts. It seemed like bismuth was just about everywhere, which tracked with the prospecting data, but zinc continued being elusive. Eventually, when randomly digging around, I got another hit of zinc, and soon another deposit revealed itself to me. By the time I exhausted this vein, I had enough zinc to last me a while. I backtracked my way into the watery shaft, but an ambush was waiting for me at the surface. A dramatic fight ensued, with me being victorious. Then, I crossed to the other side of the river into the acacia forest to harvest more sticks. Here, I saw a variety of mushrooms growing on the trunks of these mighty trees. Being tired of bamboo shoots as my exclusive diet, I collected a bunch of these bright fungi. Mainly, 2 varieties were dominating the area, the pink bonnet and the deer ear. If you're a mushroom connoisseur, you might be able to predict where this is heading into the unfortunate series of events. First, I made a mushroom stew. Next, I finished the clay pits with the sticks and the firewood and ignited the piles. While trying to record a cinematic shot in front of the pits, I accidentally set myself on fire. I jumped from the bank to douse myself in the river, but hit the bottom a little too hard, losing the majority of my health. Finally, when I made it back to my camp, I took one tasty bite of the mushroom stew, and the dreaded, but yet so familiar screen appeared on my monitor. Sure as shit, the pink bonnet was the culprit. This one was fully on me. Just like that, my temporal gear respawn was spent, and I was in danger of random respawn many thousands of blocks away. I collected my corpse, washed the bowl and the cooking pot in the bay, and begrudgingly dug out more bamboo shoots. In the afternoon of the next day, the clay offerings were finished cooking, and I placed them on the ground. Next, I loaded up the crucible with 1500 units of bismuth bronze and started getting into temperature. At this point, there was nothing else to do but to wait. Eventually, the metal was at the right temperature and I smelted an anvil and the ingots. While stuff was cooling, I built a simple compacted dirt shelter. The rift activity picked back up and I needed some place for a hay bed. Once that was done, I grabbed the anvil out of the mold and placed it on the ground. Then I grabbed the ingots as well. This allowed me to smelt another 6 ingots as the night rolled in. A temporal storm was on my doorsteps, so I barricaded myself in the dirt hut to sleep through the mess. In the morning, I dug myself out and was ready for a smithing session when I realized I had no cobblestone to craft a forge. Thus, I smelted a pickaxe in order to mine some stone. While the tools were cooling off, I started digging out large quantities of soil because I had a big project on my hands. Next, I grabbed the cooled off tool heads and crafted them into required tools. This allowed me to immerse myself into the local cave to get stone, which I then converted into cobblestone, which in turn I crafted into a couple of forges. I slapped a set of ingots on the forge and fired it up in order to bring the ingots to temp. The first thing I smithed was of course the mighty saw. I followed that up with a set of nails. Next, I processed logs into boards and with the help of nails, crafted an ultimate storage device, the trunk, a huge technological leap for a seraph. Once I deposited every single loose thing in the trunks, I jumped off the cliff to drink some water and got badly hurt in the process. I really needed to solve the water problem. Luckily, now I had the technology. Besides chests, the boards also allow me to craft a bucket. So I grabbed a water source block from the freshwater portion of the river and placed the water block in a small hole by the anvil. I now had easy access to water without needing to slog all the way to the river's bank. Next, another smithing session where I produced a set of shears, a bronze spear, a hoe, and a chisel. Besides a drinking source, the water block served as a place to quench my smith works. Come to think of it, it's kind of gross. Once the tools were cool to the touch, I grabbed my new set of shears and went uphill to find some kapaks. They seem to produce a lot more sticks than the acacias. Next, I cut down a few acacias for the wood and made more planks. With the sticks and the planks, I crafted a shit ton of ladders. I grabbed the compacted dirt from storage and started building into the sky. Just like in my desert adventure, the only way I was going to effectively grow anything was at high altitude where the temperature was significantly cooler. A tall mountain could have worked, but the path of least resistance was an ugly platform around Y255. Unfortunately, due to soil instability, I had to fully construct a packed dirt foundation first. In the end, the platform was ready to be tilled for crops. Once tilled, the farming platform was ready to receive soybeans, which was the only crop I had access to at the moment and would have for a while. Sure, I could have grown pineapples, but they are hilariously impractical. I planted about 24 plants total. At this point, all that was left to do was to descend to my base, which was a cool experience. Unfortunately, I had to eat bamboo shoots for another month at minimum. With the big tasks out of the way, I wanted to do a bit of scouting with a prospecting pick. You never know what you will find in your immediate area. I mounted a raft and started rowing out into the ocean. I quickly learned that the river's current extended pretty far. I got dragged out in the bay much further than I anticipated. I dove into murky water and prospected the chunk. I got back a very interesting result. The prospecting pick picked up salt. Despite claiming a low amount, it was shown at 67%, which was bonkers. I didn't exactly know what it meant, but it seemed like an interesting avenue to explore. After all, salt domes will often contain sylvite, which could be converted into potash, a powerful potassium fertilizer, great for the soybeans growing in my aerial farm. I went back to my base to prepare for a little exploratory mining expedition. Once the tools were ready to go, I mounted my raft once again and let the current quickly sweep me into the ocean. I dove into the darkness. At the bottom of the ocean, I started to dig a patented Oscillascape shaft. Soon, I picked up quartz on the Pro Pick, which meant a massive quartz disc was in the area. Luckily, quartz was something I was after anyway. Clear quartz would allow me to craft glass in this early progression stages, much needed for the village building that was about to occur. After going sideways, I finally managed to discover the quartz deposit. While mining the quartz from this area, the Pro Pick picked up a trace of sylvite. This could only mean one thing: a massive salt deposit was just around the corner. I did a bit more searching, and there it was, a white block of salt. Truthfully, the salt wasn't going to make a difference to me, it was kinda worthless. Sylvite, on the other hand, was the main draw of this discovery. So I hunted for sylvite inside of this massive salt shelf until I had a stack to my name. I kept a stack of salt too, and threw away the rest.
You what?
Blasphemy, I know. I went back to the quartz deposit and continued mining for clear quartz. Besides quartz, I was finding silver in just about every other quartz block. I ended up with a couple of stacks of silver to boot. This silver could be used as lantern lining down the road. Eventually, I had my stack of clear quartz, so I emerged from my shaft into the ocean, swam to the surface, and mounted the raft to make it back to the shore. Of course, the food churn had to continue, and bamboo shoots were the only game in town. The soybean harvest was far away, but now I had a trick. I stepped into the local cave to relieve a few stone blocks, and proceeded to craft a quern with said stone. This meant I could grind sylvite into its powdered form. Next, I combined powdered sylvite with water inside of a cooking pot, applied heat, and got back a batch of potash. I repeated the process to get a few more batches. Once I had enough potash, I ascended the sky farm and applied the fertilizer to my soil, making it deep brown in the process. This would speed up the growth and save me a few days in the process. With this out of the way, I could finally focus on building a village, starting with my own dwelling. But first, I had to collect a ton of building materials. I wanted to use blocks native to the area, wood, stone, plants, and other stuff pertinent to building an aesthetic settlement. So I smithed a set of fresh tools for various jobs. First material on the menu was sandstone cobble. I mounted a raft until sandstone strata dominated the bottom. I made a familiar hole in the ocean's crust and started farming the sandstone. This time around, I brought a chest with me to place on my back for extra storage on the way out. Soon, the chest was full of yellow stone, and I surfaced to take the raft back to the shore. To make cobblestone, of course, I needed a decent amount of clay. Thus, I trekked to a red clay deposit found earlier in the jungles and didn't stop until there was no more clay. Once I had the stone and the clay, I crafted the sandstone cobble and only managed to cobble together 4 stacks. Next, I went across the river to the acacia forest to grab the red tinted wood for my materials collection. Meanwhile, the drifters were becoming a huge problem for me. The rifts seemed to be online 24/7 without any sign of slowing down anytime soon. The bullthorn were particularly problematic, often hiding in the thicket and refusing to go away in the morning. Next on the docket was peridotite cobblestone. This stone type permeated my immediate area and was easily acquired at moment's notice. Nearby, a convenient cave provided access, and soon I could craft 4 stacks of this dark-colored cobble. Meanwhile, my tools were barely holding together, so I smithed a new axe, a new pickaxe, my first bronze knife, and the ever-important pantograph used to copy chisel works, courtesy of the QP Chisel mod. After the session, I wanted to acquire more wood types. For this, I went deep into the jungle as the night was rolling in. The purple heart tree grew sparingly in a thicket. The deep purple wasn't my favorite color, so I didn't collect a whole lot. In contrast, the kapok wood was extremely versatile and would be a staple in most of my builds. Going to the jungle was always a perilous occasion though. Just like at my base, bullthorn here made a mighty opponent, capable of concealing themselves like some elite special force soldiers. One in particular was preventing me from grabbing my chest full of kapok, and I had to hunt him down for a good while, making me feel like a character from a Predator movie. Eventually, the bullthorn was gone, and I strapped the chest on my back while making my way out of the suffocating density. Meanwhile, I finally hit level 3 inside of the survival skills category and could go the nudist route. Granted, I would have to take off my improvised armor and my clothes. So, I tossed my clothes over the edge of the river's bank, never to be worn again. This skill provided increased movement speed, increased health, better temperature resistance which decreased thirst, and decreased hunger rate. Everything I would possibly want at this time. Next, I went over the river to the acacia forest again. The acacia forest, besides the acacias, had plenty of ebony trees growing around for the taking. This would be the last type of wood easily available in my immediate area. While cutting down an ebony tree, I had my first encounter with the hyena. I didn't think they were capable of spawning in the wet world, but here they were. Once I loaded up on ebony, I made it back to my camp, and the weather had finally turned sour. By being surprisingly dry up to this point, the wet season had officially begun. This of course meant plenty of thunderstorms, and thus lightning would be a real threat going forward. To deal with lightning, I decided to smith a couple of lightning rods. I smithed 6 copper rods, which in turn were crafted into 2 lightning rods in the grid. With a little lightning protection, I laid out the foundation for the village's first official structure. This structure, of course, would be my house. This time around, I wanted to try something different. While I have a tendency of building big and to take a long time to finish the projects, this time around I was going for small structures built rapidly. After all, a single building a village does not make. So I laid out a simple 7x7 square with ebony flooring, sandstone foundation, and ebony logs in the corners as support struts. The walls were filled with acacia planks. Peak complexity, I know. Now that I started using planks for building, it was time to smith a wrench to rotate these set textures. For the roof, I decided to go with kapok. Besides the kapok roofing, I was going to accent the roof with a sandstone lip. Once the sandstone blocks were placed, I chiseled them to blend with the kapok roof. Upon completion of the roof, I cut out the holes for the doors and the windows and placed a kapok double door. Then I did just a tiny bit of creative chiseling to give the house a little bit of extra depth and started placing flower boxes around the perimeter of the build. Afterwards, I had an idea for an overhang made out of acacia planks directly underneath the entrance door. I thinned out the overhang with the chisel and then worked on the supporting beams holding it up. I didn't mind investing extra time into chiseling. These assets would be generally reusable across the entire village once they were made. On the left side, I placed a couple or more single block windows. Next, I started placing around the vines to make the whole structure look a bit more aged. It also felt like an appropriate theme for a jungle build. The back got the windows and the vines as well. On the side facing the river, I built a fireplace with a chimney. Following, I chiseled the chimney cap into something more interesting. I then moved the lightning rod on the roof of the house and chiseled the piece meant to hold it in place. I know that theoretically, this setup is minimally protective against lightning, but in my experience, it actually worked just fine. I never once got a stray lightning hit not targeting the rod. Next, I placed an opening into the roof and used a couple of trapdoors to make a makeshift window. On the inside, I plonked 2 wooden blocks on the floor and placed a hay bed on top of them. I then chiseled the blocks to resemble a bed frame. Now I could start moving my storage inside of the house. I placed the trunks by the right wall, stacked on top of each other. Finally, I could remove all of the loose infrastructure outside. First, I disassembled the ugly dirt tower holding the initial lightning rod. Then, I removed my smithing setup. Soon, I would dedicate a separate structure for it, but for now it had to go. The initial dirt house was scheduled for destruction next. Inside of my new crib, I placed a bunch of sandstone blocks and chiseled them into a well holding water. Cobblestone wasn't my favorite texture for home decorations, but I was not aiming for perfection. I was generally trying to avoid getting OCD and valued speed above anything else. Next, I chiseled the outside fireplace at the base of the house. Nothing complex, just more interesting than plain cobblestone. My place was coming together, but there was one major caveat. Due to the Day and Tweaks mod, the drifters would frequently invite themselves inside of the house. The door might as well not existed.
Here's Johnny.
Of course, I could have simply disabled the feature and stayed more true to the vanilla experience, but that felt like a cop-out at this point. Next, I clay formed 4 cooking pots, since my only cooking pot was now covered in gross residue from pot ash. As usual, I placed them into a firing pit and started the firing process. Meanwhile, it was time to climb the aerial farm. In the clouds, all of the soybeans were fully grown and ready for harvest. I busted out a scythe and made quick work of the mature stalks. I immediately replanted the seeds back into the soil. In the house, I placed down a few more sandstone blocks and chiseled them into something resembling a stove. Next, I grabbed the cooking pot out of the firing pit, placed it on the stove, and cooked my first soybean stew. Finally, the bamboo dyed was out and the soybean dyed was in. Meanwhile, I started building a smithy next to my house. First, I used the acacia planks to create a flat roof, and in the center, decided to build a big forge-like structure. Once I placed the forge foundation down and chiseled a custom shape for the roof, it looked something like this. Building was going a little faster now, as I was aggressively reusing chiseled shapes from my house. Next, I came up with a tie-in idea for the supporting pillars, in relation to them connecting into the roof. Following, I extended the exhaust pipe for the furnace above the roof, and then chiseled the pipe into something a bit more aesthetic. My efforts were interrupted by a notification. A temporal storm was at my doorsteps. I ran inside of the house to wait out the start timer, and eventually sleep through the storm. However, the drifters had a completely different idea. They kept coming in, and coming in, and coming in. I fought them off and almost made it to bedtime, but a loose shiver spoiled my plans. I was dead, and due to the shroom gates too, my respawn was not anchored to my house. I had a problem on my hands. So it was time to nut up or shut up. First, I had to wait out the storm's length while dead. Once the storm passed, I hit the respawn button and was placed extremely far from the house. There was one positive: I was near a river. So I concocted a plan to use the river to get back quickly. Of course, I still had to make it to the shore and construct a raft while dodging the local riffraff. I ran to one of the river's tributaries first. Once I made it there, I napped an axe head and crafted an axe in the suffocating darkness. I proceeded down the river and chopped a few kapocks that provided me with logs and vines that could be converted into rope. With that, I managed to craft a raft and an oar. I mounted the raft and started making my way downstream. However, I had another problem on my hand. I was starving to death. So I had to make a pit stop to pick up a few bamboo shoots. I napped a knife after to allow me to cut the shoots into an edible component. Once I was no longer in a dire situation, I mounted the raft and repeated almost the exact same journey from the beginning of the video, which finally dumped me into the bay. All that was left to do was to follow the band back to my house. One thing was clear: I needed a solution for my porous doors. But first, I wanted to start a cattail farm in my new compound. Of course, I could have easily used papyrus instead, but I preferred the cattail's look. Luckily, cattail tops dropped infrequently from the drifters due to the Better Drifter Loot mod. On the other hand, the Wild Farming Revival mod allowed me to propagate the cattails by combining their tops with a bit of water. I planted the resulting roots behind my house. Meanwhile, I started setting up my smithy. I placed an end mill in the middle and a couple of forges on the side. Then, I placed a couple of fire pits and a makeshift furnace. Next, I heated up a couple of bronze ingots and smith padlocks for my door. However, it wasn't that simple. I had to first learn the process for placing the padlocks on the doors. For that, I had to craft plumb and square. This allowed me to reinforce the doors, and only then was I allowed to place the padlocks on each doors. Finally, I had a fully secure door. No more drifter riffraff walking in at will. Afterwards, I continued working on the smithy. I had a fun idea of using trapdoors to create a water container for quenching smithwork like a real smithy would. Then, I started chiseling the furnace to make it look a bit more interesting. Nothing exceptionally detailed, just a bit more interesting than a plain cobblestone block. I even chiseled the sides and the back. I put up a bit of fencing around the smithy and my house and considered the smithy to be fully done. Next, I smithed a double set of nails to craft even more trunks for storage. This, however, surfaced another problem. I was almost out of charcoal. Being too lazy to start a charcoal pit, I decided to try my luck in the ocean again. So I mounted a raft and started prospecting for coal. The prospecting results were less than encouraging, but I was no stranger at trying my luck with shitty readings. So, in a typical fashion, I dug into the ocean's crust. I started digging sideways at around Y38, and in about 10 blocks, I had my first hit of coal. The amount rose rapidly, and in another 10 blocks, I found my first block of coal. The ocean was full of surprises, however. I suddenly stumbled into a block of fireclay while mining the coal. I knew that fireclay could potentially generate around the coal, but this was the first ever instance of me finding fireclay underground. First, I proceeded to load up on coal until my stability forced me to swim to the surface. I took a smoke break to restore my stability, and after went down again to load up on fireclay. I disposed of a few stragglers left over from the storm and proceeded to collect a full chest of fireclay. Once I had enough, I surfaced and rafted back to my base with the finds. My next project was to get the bees going. Luckily, during my frequent visits to the acacia forest, I happened to find a tree with a hive. First though, I ran around the acacia forest collecting golden poppies, which frequently occurred in this biome. Besides the collection of flowers, I also needed a large amount of papyrus to craft the skeps. My cattail farm was still not producing. So I trekked between various bodies of water in the jungle and collected the patches growing around the banks. By the time I gathered enough papyrus for my needs, the sun was setting down and the rift activity increased dramatically. Not wanting to risk returning through the jungle, once again I chose the river for the fast travel. I cut down a local purple heart and tried crafting a raft, but the bullthorn were interrupting this process a lot. Here I learned a new trick. It was possible to craft things while fully submerged in the water. Honestly, not a terrible way to avoid the drifter threat. Once again, I crafted a raft and an oar and proceeded to use the river's current to take me back to my base in a very timely manner. The amount of papyrus I brought home was enough to craft 8 skeps. I grabbed one of the skeps and crossed to the acacia side to look for the tree with the hive. Once I located the tree, I built a platform out of compacted dirt on which I placed regular soil, and eventually I filled this platform with flowers. In the middle, I placed an empty skep. Next, I returned to my base and started decorating. Besides golden poppies, I managed to find a variety of flowers, ferns, and cacti in the acacia plains. The cacti looked particularly cute inside of the flower boxes around the house. Inside of the house, I placed a cow's skull. This was perhaps my most prized possession, since I only managed to locate a single one through the entire playthrough. Following, I clay formed 5 big flower pots. I was serious about my decor this time around. While trying to fire the pots, I caused a brush fire on my plateau. Luckily, the brush fire did not cause any unwanted damage, but it was certainly a wake-up call to be more careful. I did not want to burn down my awesome village. Finally, I grabbed some shears and went to town on the local acacias to get enough sticks for the beehive fencing. Once I had enough, I started placing the fencing behind my house. When the fence was done, I placed 2 layers of ebony planks and surrounded them with trapdoors. These would be the posts holding up the skeps. It was time to go back to the tree with the hive and reclaim the flowers. So I recovered all of the flowers and grabbed the now populated skep. I took it home and placed it on the empty podium. All that was left to do was to plant the flowers and to leave the bees to do their bee things. Next, I wanted to get my hands on a lot more ingot molds. The limited amount I had now made smelting a very tedious process. However, I kept getting interrupted by the drifters. In general, the drifters start to become a massive pain in my butt. They started to show up as early as 6 PM and didn't go away until 8 AM. This meant only 10 hours of drifter-free time per day. To add insult to injury, the rift activity refused to settle down. In the morning, I finished the moles and started making the firing pits. This time around, I played it safe and made elevated pits out of compacted dirt. No more playing with fire. Besides the molds, I also clay formed more flower pots. I loaded the pits with typical components and ignited the piles. While the ingot molds were processing, I worked on chiseling an ingot stand design. For once, I was not going to place them on the floor. Eventually, I came up with a passable design out of peridotite cobble. Now, I had the ingot stands, but no real structure to put them in. I would eventually have a better solution, but for now, they would hang out on the edge of the smithy. Meanwhile, the beehives were all occupied now and buzzing with activity. Meanwhile, the first harvest of cattails was upon me. As soon as I harvested them, I once again propagated the tops, which gave me enough roots to make a legitimate farm. I marked out another plot of land with a fence, dug out the soil, and made a little pool filled with water. Many of you pointed out that cattails do not require water, but it felt wrong to leave them on dry land. It is a wetland plant after all. Once the ingot molds were finished firing, I placed them in several rows in front of the smithy. This of course meant that I could smelt 20 bars at once, which is exactly what I did after. The bees were quietly cooking in the background, and it was time to collect my first batch of honeycomb.
Ладно, может отсюда больше похож. Разве знаешь, что придет в голову этим пчелам?
I crafted a couple of straw dummies to put in the enclosure. They had some utility of distracting the bees during the honeycomb harvest, but mainly it was for aesthetics. I broke the hives apart and replaced the skeps with the fresh ones. Then I went inside of the house and squeezed the honey into the bucket. With the remaining beeswax and flax fibers, I started cooking candles inside of the residue-laden pot. Meanwhile, I smelted the silver that I got during the quartz mining. Once the ingots cooled off, I slapped 4 silver bars on the forge and smithed 2 plates out of them. With one of the plates, a candle, and some clear quartz, I crafted a silver lantern. There was no reason to use silver over copper besides the bling factor. The remaining silver plate served as lining for the lantern, bumping its luminosity to 20. I finally had a fancy, max light silver lantern. It was in with the lantern and out with the oil lamp. For the rest of the lanterns, I went back to using regular copper plates. I used the silver plates as a lantern lining instead. I spread around the lanterns, but was quickly forced indoors by the drifters. Meanwhile, a regular vanilla drifter dropped me a temporal gear. This was a welcome turn of events, and I immediately secured my spawn inside of the house. In other news, I was on the last pot of soybeans, so it was time to climb into the clouds to check on my farm. Luckily, it was ready for harvest. After the harvest, I would have more seeds than my farm could accommodate. I had to expand a bit. I built out the foundation with compacted dirt, placed the raw soil, added the water, and then tilled the land. Once the land was tilled, I harvested the previous batch and replanted the seeds. With my dietary needs met, it was time to start expanding my village. I was going to invite other traders to live on my compound. Of course, they would need places to live at first. And thus, I started my first double-decker. This new building was going to be a small square with a large glass panel wrapping around 2 of the sides. Once I placed the walls of the first floor, I cut out an opening for the glass and added the quartz glass panes. Following, I chiseled them to remove the border and to make them transparent while seemingly made out of a single, continuous piece. I then chiseled a thin wood frame around the border of the glass panel. For the entrance, I chose an acacia door next to the panel. I then chiseled the door's frame to be more interesting. For the floor material, I chose purple hard planks. I finally found something to do with this wood type. On the right side of the building, I placed a stairway made with acacia planks. I then placed the floor of the second story. Next, I started building out the walls of the second floor. I was going to switch the color and use peridotite. Just like with the previous floor, I put in a large glass panel, but this time around it was offset from the bottom story. All other non-panel walls would be adorned with windows to prevent them from looking plain. To prevent the stairwell from looking boring, I covered it up with a bunch of leaves. I then scattered around more leaves and placed vines on the walls to make the house look a bit older. Finally, I placed a simple acacia roof on top, but left the upper portion of the roof open and lined with ebony planks. This would serve as a patio to hang out and to engage in some meditative retrospection. Between the first and the second floor, I placed a series of trapdoors to create a lip. I then decided to build an overhang above the bottom door. I used the assets from the overhang in my house to make it an easy task. To make the house a bit more interesting, I used the typical trick of placing various flower boxes around the perimeter. Finally, the exterior was done, but I was not going to leave the inside empty. When conceiving this playthrough, I set myself a goal of providing reasonable accommodation for my tenants. First, I copied the design for the frame that held the hay bed from my own house. Next, I put in a water source inside for cooking and drinking, again similar to my own place. After all, people living here would have needs too. Following, I chiseled them a little stovetop for cooking and even provided a cooking pot out of my own supplies. Yes, the interior was pretty cramped, but these were much nicer apartments than what I provided traders in my Skyblock playthrough. The second floor got the same exact interior. As a bonus, people living here would have access to the patio on the roof, where I placed a cacti box and chiseled a custom bench for chilling. This marked the completion of the build, and I was reasonably happy with the result. I never claimed to be an expert on interior design, but at least I was getting some practice. While taking a cinematic shot of my new build, I experienced my first ever solar eclipse, which was a cool little event. It was time to entice a few traders to live in my new village. You build and they will come. Or at least that was the idea. So far, I had encountered exactly 2 traders. Outside of that, however, locating traders in the jungle was a big challenge. The carts were often obscured by trees on the map, and exploring the jungle was always a challenging proposition, marked by poor visibility and frequent encounters with the drifters. I started by going around the acacia forest to the east, where I spotted an obvious cart on the map. Once I landed on the shore, I located the artisan trader in the thicket. An artisan trader was not that useful to me at the moment. Realistically, I had nothing to trade him, and he was useless for building up my wealth. Instead, I started making my way to the original spawn point where I saw the treasure hunter. I found that using various non-river bodies of water was the easiest way to get into the jungle as quickly as possible. When there was no water around, I walked on foot through the foggy and rainy jungle through the walls of the capox and the bamboo. Eventually, I made it to the trader and made him an offer he couldn't refuse. I told him about my awesome place, and he seemed thrilled to join. Thus, I offered him a cozy ride in my cage. Originally made for animals, courtesy of the Animal Cages mod, these cages now served as dual purpose, livestock transport, and spontaneous merchant relocation. Consent is, implied.
I think we made some alligators very happy.
So here we are, back to fucking square one.
Following, I used the familiar trick of using the river's flow to quickly travel downstream to my only other confirmed trader sighting. The building materials trader quickly agreed to my terms and hopped into my cage. Totally willingly, I swear. I made my way downstream in a journey that was very familiar at this point. The river spat me into the bay, and I navigated my way around the acacia forest to my house. Then, I introduced the traders to their new accommodations. The building materials trader got the downstairs suite, and the treasure hunter took the upper floor. While generally happy with their new setup, they did ask me for a couple more favors. First, they complained about the apartments not having any light, and I happily scavenged a few lanterns from the outside. They also asked for a hot meal, and I shared my famous soybean stew recipe with them. Sure hope they liked it, cause that's all I had. Finally, they asked for the sign-up bonus that I promised them as an incentive, and I scavenged the coffers to give them 4 rusty gears each. However, that was my entire capital up to this point. It was time to build it back up via trading. I went to my smithy and started making an assortment of bismuth bronze offerings to sell. Both traders wanted various bismuth bronze tools. This was the reason I chose to invite these 2 traders in the first place. Once I smithed these tools, I made my first set of trades. One thing was clear, it was time to transition to iron. This was less to do with iron's efficiency and more to do with my limited supply of bismuth bronze. It will be reserved to smith tools intended for future trading. Luckily, I did have a lead on hematite already. To the south of my base, there was a small lake sitting on the edge of the jungle. Here, I managed to scout small quantities of hematite earlier in the playthrough. Since I'm a big fan of mining around various bodies of water, this was a natural starting point. To my surprise, the hematite results here were more than promising, and soon I had a spot in mind. I dug into the bottom of the lake and proceeded directly down, being fairly confident. Iron is by far the easiest metal to find in my experience. Before I even reached the bottom of the world, I stumbled into iron without having to do any extra digging. I spent a lot of time down here mining the precious metal. As typical for hematite in this game, the deposit was absolutely massive. Eventually, the low temporal stability forced me to surface, but I had more than enough iron to last me a lifetime at this point. And in other good news, fireclay demand was already solved. Of course, I still needed to craft and fire a bunch of fireclay bricks first. So, I busted out the compacted dirt and constructed some pits. I placed the bricks into the pits, loaded them with grass, wooden planks, firewood, and started the cooking process. Meanwhile, I kept producing batches of bronze ingots until eventually I fully ran out of every single component. The fireclay bricks were done cooking, so I collected them and crafted the bloomeries. I placed them down by the ingot stations, loaded them with iron and coal, and ignited the bloom process. I slept through the night to speed up the bloomeries, and in the morning broke them apart to extract the blooms. I started processing the blooms into ingots and smithing iron goodies. I smithed every tool imaginable: axe, pickaxe, chisel, you name it. And of course, I smithed the blackguard sword to deal with the drifters as well. Meanwhile, the worst case scenario was playing out outside. Dry lightning was happening around my area with no rain to be found. This phenomenon is the one responsible for many burnt down houses. To deal with this, I quickly placed the second lightning rod on the roof patio to protect the new house. Once again, the lightning did seem to only strike the rods and never any other blocks. With the house protected, it was time to expand one more time. I decided to build another double-decker placed directly next to the smithy. This required a bit of clearing this time around. The bamboo overgrowth had to go, and the land had to be made even. Eventually, I had the dimensions figured out and started building. Ebony logs formed the frame that was the foundation for the walls. The purple hard planks were the foundation for the floors. To fill in the walls, I used a mix of stripped kapok logs combined with regular kapok planks. I placed a kapok door on the first floor and worked on the windows, which I filled with quartz glass. Soon I ran out of quartz glass, however, but it was a simple fix. It was as easy as filling a bunch of bloomeries with quartz, and I had plenty of the stuff laying around. The first floor was coming together, which looked something like this. Next, I laid out the floor of the second story. While things might look smooth in the edit, I was in a perpetual struggle with the drifters. The rift activity seemed to be stuck in high gear. On the other hand, the temporal gears were starting to pour into my possession, which meant I wasn't that concerned with dying. Meanwhile, I started working on the second floor, which would be mostly identical to the first, minus one section. The glass was done cooking, so after cutting the blocks in half with the saw, I placed them in the empty windows. Now I could start placing the roof in the smaller section of the second floor. In the unfortunate series of events, this roofing project was next to my cattail pond, where cattails stood fully mature. Unfortunately, bullthorns just loved hiding in them. You might see where this is going. Eventually, one sneaky bastard sniped me off the roof. Luckily, temporal gears were aplenty. So I used another temporal gear in my house, picked up my skeletal body, found the culprit in the weeds, and avenged my death. Then I chiseled the edges of the sandstone cobble, finished the acacia roof, and that section was now done. Now I had to build the main roof section. I once again used the sandstone cobble for the lip, which I chiseled to my liking. Next, I slowly placed the angle acacia roof sections and covered the very top with a few planks. The structure was now complete, but it wouldn't be my build without the embellishments. It was time for a bunch of flower boxes to spice up the build. To make the flower box design a bit more interesting, I was going to place them on platforms, even with the second floor, supported by the wooden struts. Once I came up with a design and copied it around the outside of the walls, I started decorating the house with the usual suspects: vines, leaves, and flowers. As far as the choice of flowers, I wanted to use more tropical varieties for this house. Up to this point, I was using cacti and temperate species, so I went out to collect some local crotons and ferns. The plants really imbued the house with a more tropical vibe. With the exterior done, there was of course interior to take care of. First, I started with the patented bed frames. Then I copied the water well design from the previous house. Next, I copied the stove design as well. There was a bit more space in this place compared to others, so a new table and the chair design emerged from the extra space. Meanwhile, I knew that lanterns would be a requirement now. I chose iron as the main component for the lanterns, since I had an abundance of these ingots on hand. The remaining copper was used to smith even more lightning rods. These rods felt like a necessary feature of the houses, just like the lanterns. To get more lanterns, I first harvested the cattails from the pond, which meant that I could cycle the beehives and harvest another batch of honey while replacing the skeps. the honeycomb was squeezed out, and the wax was used for candles again. With iron plates, candles, and some glass, I crafted more lanterns. This marked the full completion of my new rental unit. I proceeded on a journey to find new residents. At first, I explored the Northern Ocean via a raft. Unfortunately, I couldn't afford to construct a ship. They required a lot of linen cloth, and the Joy of Sailing mod that I used in my Island Challenge playthrough removed their ship variants, which was a bad call in my opinion. The regular raft it was. The ocean stretched far north with just a single island. The island was empty and had nothing worthy of note. So I turned around and started rowing back to the land. It was time to immerse myself into the jungle. To the west, the jungle cleared a bit and I was able to use a map to locate a few carts. The first trader I found was a clothing variety. Clothing traders stock linen sheets, which in absence of flax would be my only source of linen in the game. There was something else interesting on the map that was clearly visible. A large set of ruins ripe for the taking. A set of ruins this big was clearly worthy of exploration. Mostly, I was hoping to get my hands on some grains, since that would open a possibility of an animal farm. I searched around for various cracked vessels, collected bony soil, and had moderate success in finding what I was after. Once I stashed all of the loot in a chest, I started heading east, where I located yet another trader, clearly visible on the map. This happened to be an agricultural trader. Not as vital as the clothing trader, but still opening up a few possibilities. So I invited him to my kingdom as well. The easiest way home once again was a river. This time around a different one, but still leading directly to the ocean, which then allowed me for an easy route home. I welcomed my new residents to their respective rooms and asked them about their accommodations. I heard no complaints.
It's my landlord, Pearl. I'm really late on my rent.
Oh, I'm getting out of here, man. She's nasty.
No, please. I need you to stay. This is gonna be ugly.
I inspected the loot from the ruined city, and while I only found 4 flax seeds, I did find a bit of grain, which could be easily converted into seeds using the Wild Farming Revival mod. I took these seeds to my sky farm and found soybeans to be fully matured. First, I planted a little bit of rye and a tiny amount of flax. Next, I harvested the soybeans and planted another batch. Back on Earth, my eternal struggle against the drifters was in full swing. They were knocking on my door 24/7, but in turn, I could easily farm them for extra loot. Bolthorns were another story. They still loved to hide in cattails, hang with the bees, and to camouflage in the bamboo. It was no surprise then that they were the cause of yet another death. But at this point, I didn't care a whole lot about dying. Next, I placed a few water blocks by my house and tilled the land. I planted the rice on this new field. Believe it or not, it was too cold to grow rice in the sky this late in the season. Meanwhile, I did yet another round of trading. This time around, the agricultural trader offered me a couple of new options to make bank. Mainly, he wanted bismuth bronze hoes and bismuth bronze scythes, which opened up a few more options. On top of that, the agricultural trader also offered some berries for sale. This was a good opportunity to start a berry operation. I bought out his stock of cranberries and converted them into seeds, again courtesy of the Wild Farming Revival mod. I planted the seeds on the other side of the beehive. It would take them another 6 days to fully mature into full bushes. Meanwhile, it was time to expand one more time, and this time around, I was going for a combo house instead of a double-decker. I was once again using ebony logs to make the frame of this project. The bottom level was going to be filled with peridotite cobble. In the middle was going to be a 2-way staircase, for which I chose the stripe pattern with ebony and acacia planks. I chiseled an opening from the backside to the downstairs rooms. One of these downstairs rooms would house the rice plot, and the other was going to house the ingot stands, since they didn't fit inside of the smithy. For the front of the bottom floor, I used some fencing and a bit of custom chisel work with the acacia wood. Next, I laid out the patented purple hard floors. For the walls, I once again used acacia planks. At this point, I was much less selective about the colors and textures and simply used whatever I had the most of on hand. Both of these platforms would house identical houses with kapok doors opening to the stairs. I had more kapok than any other wood, so I decided to go for kapok roof. Once the roofs were done, I decided to copy the shelf flower box design from the previous house. After the flower boxes were put in, the build was starting to look pretty cool on the outside. Next, I started placing the patented vines, leaves, and other decorations to make the building feel a little more tropical and weathered. Meanwhile, the cranberry bushes matured from the seedlings, and I harvested them to replant them a little neater. I was going to place some more spaced out, and thus I had to expand the area with compacted dirt and soil. I then placed the bushes in a bunch of rows and used compacted dirt to imitate a path. Following, I built a fence and left the bushes to do their thing. I pivoted to furnishing the combo house afterwards. This was a predictable affair of copying various assets that I created previously. First, I copied the table and the chair. Then the bed frame with a hay bed. Following, I replicated the water well. Of course, the stove came next with a pre-cooked meal, knowing it would be a requirement now. With the interiors done, I installed another lighting rod on each roof. It was time to look for more tenants yet again. At this point, I exhausted all of the easy possibilities. I didn't have any idea where to look, so I used the good old brute force method. Sprinting blindly through the jungle wasn't a particularly exciting affair, but eventually I found a cart with a commodities trader inside. I invited him inside of my inside of my village. Meanwhile, the rift activity rose to apocalyptic levels, and traveling in the jungles at night was a death wish. I was forced to adapt and thus learned a new trick. Apparently, Yoserif has no issues with sleeping underwater, so I swam with the fishes while sleeping through the night, thus bypassing the worst of the worst. Sure, it wasn't particularly realistic, but I didn't ask too many questions. Eventually, I found yet another cart with another clothing trader inside of a foggy and gloomy jungle. I invited him to the village. To get back, I once again used the river system, so familiar to me at this point. At home, I unloaded the residents in their respective houses and gave them their sign-up bonus. I didn't have any lanterns ready though, so I started smithing iron plates to craft some. At this time, I was finally able to invest into the finishing touches, a metalworking skill category which occasionally auto-completed smithing works, which started to speed up my metal production by a lot. Soon I had the place for the lanterns, which I placed inside of the new houses. Next, I smithed more bismuth bronze tools and did another round of trading. The commodities trader stocked sulfur and cloth this time around, so I grabbed all of it. I also visited the clothing traders and bought out their respective stocks of cloth as well. I finally had some linen to work with, and I immediately crafted 4 linen bags. The reed baskets lasted me far too long. My inventory was finally not oppressively tiny. Plus, I finally reached a high enough level in the survival skills category and could pick up the extra 3 slots to boot. It felt really good. Meanwhile, it was time for another village expansion project. With my first harvest of grains coming up, I was thinking about doing a pig farm. So I started clearing out some space for the pig pen by removing bamboo and evening the ground. At this point, flat and clear real estate was running out. While working on it, I had my first instance of hail in the game. This completely derailed my progress, but at least it was a cool experience. However, I wasn't going to sleep this time around. Instead, I decided to make a cellar underneath my house intended for panning. I had about 30 blocks of bony soil from the various ruins that was worth panning through. So I built out a cellar directly underneath my house with periodized cobblestone. Once it was done, I placed some water in a trench and started auto-panning through the night. By the end of the first session, I had a decent collection of gems that could be potentially traded for gears. Meanwhile, the hailstorm passed and I could resume building. First, I placed the ebony pillars of the main barn once I figured out the dimensions of the build. However, the short days quickly forced me back to panning as the dusk set as early as 4 p.m. By the end of the session, all of the bony soil was panned through and I resumed working on the barn in the morning. Soon I could place a roof over the main barn structure. I did a bit of chiseling on the barn, and as the night set in, I mounted a raft and made my way to the artisan trader I located earlier. I didn't intend to kidnap him, invite him to my village, but it was just too tempting to pass up the opportunity. I decided that I could let him live in my house for now until I could find him a better place. Maybe this was a mistake, because when I released him in my crib, he was levitating as to remind me what I have awakened. I tried not to be overly concerned and traded him a bunch of gems instead. With the proceeds, I went around and bought out all of the linen that was available. Next, I ground some sulfur and combined reeds, honey, and sulfur to make my first bandages. The bandages were handy to have around, since the drifters were not going to fuck off anytime soon or ever. Going back to the barn, I lined the floor with compacted dirt. I then started building the stalls that would be attached to the barn, starting with some stall fencing. I raised the pillars with acacia planks and placed parallel kapok beams. The pillar design was borrowed from the previous builds per usual. Meanwhile, I could finally craft myself a linen bed. The extra hour and a half of sleep it allowed was certainly appreciated. Outside, the berry bushes were flowering and would soon ripen. The pig farm was nearing completion when I finished constructing the stalls and was ready to put in the roof. Kapok was the material of choice for the roof. It was still by far the most plentiful in my storage. After installing 4 angle roof blocks, I finished the roof with flat planks for a bit of roofing variety in my village. Now all that was left to do was to build a fence attached to the barn and the stalls. Next, I placed a bunch of large troughs inside of the barn. The final result looked pretty cool for how little effort I put into building it. Of course, I still had to capture the pigs. Earlier, when exploring the nearby mountain, I spotted a few, so I was pretty confident heading in that direction. First, I had to climb the steep slopes all the way to the top. I did indeed find the pigs in the high altitude biome, but capturing them in this mountainous environment was a huge pain in the ass. Once they started running, it was bye-bye. The final strategy was digging a hole for the piggies and then force pushing them down, at which point they were easy enough to capture. Eventually, I had 4 sows trapped in the cages. I delivered the cages to my new farm and released them into their new enclosure. After which, I repeated the exact same dance to capture 4 more, including a male. However, my grains were not yet ready for harvest. Instead, I harvested my last batch of soybeans while not even bothering to replant. At this point, the soybeans were going to last me a long time. I went back to decorating the pig farm with the usual suspects. To add a little more interest to the enclosure, I built a couple of homemade watering troughs. Meanwhile, my village wouldn't be complete without a windmill. I started clearing a plot of land behind the smithy to place the said windmill. Once the area was clear, I started building the foundation with the peridotite cobble. In front of the cobble foundation was going to be an entrance made out of planks and logs. The small entrance would have an acacia roof. Next, I built a wooden platform that was a bit wider than the foundation, about 8 blocks above, kind of like a skirt. Then I continued building up with sandstone cobble, kapok planks, and kapok logs. The foundation's floor was going to be made out of sandstone cobble. Consequently, this is where I planned to have my health hammer set up. Following, I kept raising the height of the tower until it looked tall enough to be a windmill. Another 8 blocks above, I built a much smaller platform. I adorned the perimeter of the platform with sandstone cobble, and the windmill was ready for the rotor installation. The partially built windmill looked something like this. It looked a bit all over the place, but I would make it look a lot more cohesive by the end. Meanwhile, the various grains were fully mature, and I could collect them from their respective plots. This meant I could finally deconstruct the sky farm. This was mostly a decision rooted in aesthetics. It was ugly and had to go. On the ground, I went to the pig farm and filled the troughs with rice, rye, and flax. I left the pigs to feast and breed. Back at the windmill, I started figuring out the clearance needed for the sails. They would have to extend at least 4 blocks away from the top section that they were on. I had enough fat, resin, and linen collected over the length of this playthrough to craft a test rotor with a full set of sails. Next, I wanted to make the extensions that the rotors were resting in to look more natural. So I covered the openings with planks and chiseled a gradual fade into the tower. Now, the rate limiting step would be the sails. I would still need a ton of extra linen to craft them. So, I did another set of trades and bought any linen stock I could afford. By the end, I had a very decent amount of linen, almost enough for the 4x3 windmill setup. The linen sheets covered one component, that still left fat and resin. The acacia planes were the answer to both of those resources. Hunting hyenas was one of the few ways to get my hands on extra fat. Unfortunately, they very rarely drop this precious commodity. Furthermore, the acacia trees were resin-carrying species, and that meant there was no shortage of resin due to the sheer amount of trees in the area. When I had enough resin, I checked the banks of the local rivers for the gazelles. They could be trapped for a bit of extra fat, although they were hilariously annoying to hunt, especially when fighting the currents. The resource hole from the acacia plains allowed me to craft additional rotors and more sails. I climbed the windmill and proceeded to create the other extensions that would house the rotors, after which I installed the sails. Now I could finish building the roof. Then a few more small details and the windmill was complete. At least on the outside. The inside was a different story. I crafted a bunch of gears and axles and started routing the windmill power all the way to the bottom floor, which is where I was going to place my health hammer setup. However, I ran out of every ounce of fat before I could reach the bottom floor. I would have to wait until my piggies produced some offsprings before I could finish. Meanwhile, I heated up a bunch of iron blooms, selected the last point into the finishing touches, and started smithing the heads for the health hammers. The finishing touches skill was doing a lot of heavy lifting, frequently finishing my smithworks instantly. Soon I had enough materials to craft the health hammers with their respective bases to be placed at the bottom level. While I was busy building the windmill, the berries were busy ripening and the field was now ready for harvest. Once I had the berries, I crafted the fruit press and juiced the hell out of the supply. I placed 2 barrels in the cellar and filled them with juice. Finally, I sealed them to make wine. Too bad, I completely forgot about this fact afterwards. While waiting on the piggies to reproduce, I started figuring out the design for the village's fence. I came up with several ideas and ultimately picked one. Enveloping the village with a fence was a large project, so I had to take a detour to cut a few great kapocks, and before long, my inventory was brimming with this awesome wood. Next, I immersed myself in the fence. I placed the plain kapok planks around the entire perimeter. Then, diligently copied the design around using the ever-important pantograph. In front of the village, I placed a set of double doors that were 3 blocks high to match the fence. I then chiseled the fence posts a bit to make them less plain. I copied everything from the front of the village to the back to have another way to enter the village. Meanwhile, the sows gave birth, and fresh of the both piglets were running around. Now, I could kill the remaining adults for the fat and leave the kiddos to grow up orphaned. With the excess meat, I decided to try something new, something I haven't attempted before, mostly for the sake of practice. I still had a stack of halite, so I ground it into salt and then placed the meat and the salt into the barrels for curing. I finally could produce enough gears and axles to finish the routing inside of the windmill. However, when I was done, the wind was absent and I did not hear the familiar clanking. Instead, I got the rest of my iron cooking in the bloomeries. By the time the bloomeries got done cooking, the wind picked up and I processed all of the blooms on my new setup. I also refreshed all of my tools as they were near their end. I felt good not having to smith by hand for once. Most of the iron would go into the iron plates to make lanterns for the village. So I harvested the cattails, collected the beehives, replaced them with fresh skeps, squeezed the honey into the buckets, and then cooked more candles with the resulting beeswax. This allowed me to craft a lot of lanterns. I then spent a bit of time chiseling a design for a lamppost. After settling on one, I spread a bunch of these lampposts around and installed the lanterns into them. This was a surprisingly long and annoying process, even with the help of the pantograph. Meanwhile, my time was running out, and I only had a few more projects I could possibly tackle before the 100-day mark. First, I wanted to build the artisan trader squatting in my house his own dwelling as promised. This was probably my weakest design, because I simply did not spend a lot of time developing it. First, I raised a small peridotite tower, about 10 blocks tall. I then attached a small wooden crown on top of it. The frame of the house was made out of kapok logs. For the walls, I went with ebony planks, mostly because that's what I had left. I chiseled the kapok logs to create an interesting frame for the ebony and placed a bunch of windows around. For the roof, I went with a T-type design with acacia wood as the variant. I then furnished the new house by copying a bunch of props from the other locations. Soon, I moved the artisan trader into the building. I finally had my own house back to myself. This wasn't my best work, but I was already feeling the burnout. At this point, I did some final decorative work in the village. I spread around more leaves, flowers, plants, and other props, mostly for the sake of the thumbnail. Finally, I did some rounds around my village, admiring my handiwork. I felt pretty proud. The village turned out pretty awesome, considering I did not plan it in the creative mode and it was limited to a 100-day span. Finally, I meditated the rest of the time away on my little roof patio, reminiscing about the jungle challenge. This village was near and dear to my heart now, and was an awesome memento to the thick jungle world. But I would never see it again. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. There will be new adventures and new worlds, and of course my forever world will continue chugging throughout the years, but this world would be forgotten. Another biome challenge complete. If you're still here, I love you. This one was a lot of fun, and perhaps the most compelling world from all of the playthroughs. The game did a remarkable job at generating the jungle biome. Granted, I had to increase the tree density by 100%. The highlight of the playthrough though was the rivers mod. I think Tyrone and the team need to integrate rivers into the game ASAP. I was surprised by how much the river generation enhanced the world gen and introduced a lot of emergent gameplay. If I had one criticism of the jungle biome, it's the variety of animals and crops. More tropical plant variety in terms of sustenance would add a bit more depth into the game. We are also missing dangerous tropical animals. So larger cats, tigers, panthers, and maybe megafauna like elephants would be an awesome addition to the game. Regardless, I can see this type of world being a lot of fun in a multiplayer environment. The heart of the jungle is an insane place to survive. Solo, it gets pretty nutty and overwhelming quickly. In my practice run, I tried living in the jungle and failed miserably. The drifters spawned non-stop day and night, but for a larger group with regular respawn rules, I can see it being a lot of fun. This was the primary reason I looked for less dense places to settle. As far as what's next, the Desert Challenge redo with the Thirst mod seems to be high on y'all wishlist. I also want to do another attempt at Skyblock with a downloadable mod pack to atone for the fact that I never released my original one. At this point it's old and outdated, and I doubt anyone would want to run 1.19 just to play it. Furthermore, I want to interview Tyrone one more time. It has been a year since our first episode, and I hope he agrees to do another Vintage Voices. These ideas will be a high priority for me, but as always, I have way more ideas than time. I love making videos for y'all, and will continue to do so as long as you keep watching. I hope you're having a great summer, just with fewer drifters, and on that note, Oscillascape is beaming out.